Hello guys, welcome to the Wars and Weapons channel. In my last video, I told you to recommend what should the contents of my next video be in the comments. There were no recommendations, so I actually had to choose a subject myself. Now, in my last video, I talked about East Asia and I talked a lot about China. And in another one of my videos about gunpowder, I talked about the fire lance and told you how popular and how effective it was against enemies, and that the Chinese were actually good using spears and lances at the time. So I sat and thought to myself, well, what better subject to speak about in my next video other than spears? So spears also had a long story of their invention. They were just like the swords. They were also invented before the Christian Jesus was born, right before 0 BC or 0 AD, whatever you're going to call it. So it was also used for hunting, just like the sword. Now, the reason it was, so you may ask, well, they had swords and axes for hunting. Why did they need the spears? Well, the fact of the spear had one advantage that the sword and axe didn't. It was the advantage that it was capable of being thrown at range. Well, the axe and the sword couldn't have been thrown. I mean, they could have been thrown, but they weren't as effective as lances and spears. The reason the spear was invented was actually because they wanted to throw things at prey's longer ranges, such as like some animals they wanted to hunt were dangerous if they got in close. Some animals wouldn't have gotten close, but if you would have get close, they would escape, so you couldn't hunt them. So they had to think of a solution, which came to the invention of the spear. They would take a long stick and then they would sharpen the tip to be able to throw it. And the sharpened tip later on evolved and replaced the stone tip to be able to pack more punch and sometimes cover more distance, because if the weight of the tip was heavier, it could pack a lot more punch and sometimes would cause things to get a longer range. Now, they were using this as their main weapon to hunt animals from long range while carrying a sword or an axe for close range. Now, later on, the spear was used in battles, but it actually soon got replaced by the bows and arrows. Well, bows and arrows, not the bow, but the arrow is actually some kind of a spear. It's just shortened and made lighter and less thick to be able to cover more distance with more speed while packing the same amount of punch. So if you actually saw a arrow, you actually see how familiar, how similar their shape is to the spear. So you could say they are from the same family, but the spears were actually later on used in wars to take down mounted enemies due to their ability to, they were pretty long, so you could easily hold them like this whenever an enemy was charging to be able to use their charging power against them. Now, the spear also later on evolved to become made out of bronze instead of the stone chip tip. And then later on got evolved to become the iron. And then later on, it evolved to other forms that were used as throwing weapons, just like the spears were back when they were just invented. Now, you may ask, well, what were they? They were the javelins. Javelin today is an anti-tank weapon. But in those days, it was kind of an anti-tank weapon because it actually had far more penetration power than the bow and arrow. So whenever you were throwing the javelin, you actually could penetrate longer armor, such as elephants. While the Romans were fighting the Carthaginians, the Carthaginians were using elephants, which actually had a pretty thick skin. They could not penetrate using regular bows. They had to penetrate using spears and javelins. So they actually trained auxiliaries, which were highly trained in throwing spears over elephants to be able to kill them without bows and arrows. Now, that's the story of the spear. That's enough for today. Make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments what should the contents of my next video be about. Thank you for watching and stand by for the next video.